Hello everybody, my name's Shona Murray and thank you for the invitation to talk at the Play in the Park conference. I'm going to be talking about my research, the pros and cons of autistic parenthood. I'm in my office at the moment, so I've got a blue wall behind me and a brown leather sofa, and I'm a white woman with long brown hair and a flowery blue top on. So this research was done as part of my master's dissertation at Sheffield Hallam University, and I am currently, it was a few years ago, it's just been published this year, and I'm currently doing a PhD at Lincoln University about fabricated and induced illness, because a lot of autistic parents and parents of autistic children are getting accused of it. It's what used to be known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. I can be contacted by email shonalouisemurphy@yahoo.co.uk or on Twitter @Shona_MU, and I have a website, shonamurphy.me, so feel free to get in touch if you have any questions. So my research questions are: how do autistic parents believe autism impacts parenting? What are the positives of being an autistic parent, and what are the negatives of being an autistic parent? It was a qualitative study because I was looking at people and their experiences. I used interviews because autistic people can often be anxious, and there's the sensory elements to consider and different communication needs. I let people choose the method of communication, and I used thematic analysis. This is my thematic map, which I'll go through in the next 10 minutes in a bit more detail. 4 major themes: autistic characteristics, relationships, and indirect effects of autism and stress. So autistic characteristics, sensory came up in this, which was quite a big one. Since I did my research, there is actually a new research that has been published by Molnar Talsa, and that's about much more detailed about sensory side of it and what problems autistic people have, how it impacts them, and that would be useful because it's got recommendations for OTs and support that we could use. But in my research with my 6 participants, I got a bit of a mixed bag for sensory. There were a lot of things that came up that made it more difficult, and there were also some positives because for example, one lady said that her children were a sensory delight. She liked to hug them and smell them and kiss them, and she'd never had that from her own parents. Another lady described issues when she went to the supermarket, for example, with the noises and smells, and how that was really hard for her son because she'd sometimes suddenly have to go home. So there was a bit of a mixed bag. Planning and organising was definitely an issue for everybody in my study. 5 people said that they really struggled with it, and the 6th said that she was really good at it, but there was some negativity still because she said her children and husband found her very controlling and they didn't like that. This is actually congruent with research done by Paul et al, because they also found that autistic mothers were more likely than non-autistic mothers to not consider themselves an organised parent. Other autistic characteristics in that, I had things like demand avoidance, passionate interest, and objective thinking. So demand avoidance was negative, and 2 people mentioned that, but with one lady it was very serious in that the baby crying was perceived as a demand by her when it was the baby was hungry, and so she had a lot of difficulties feeding him, and they ended up back in hospital, and he was underweight. But passionate interest was positive. One lady became interested in childcare and development and became a bit of an expert on that, which is obviously useful. Objective thinking was how the dad in the study supported his child. He said he was very good at looking at the situation objectively when school called him in about something, and if he needed to support his child rather than just supporting the teachers automatically, then he was able to do that. indirect effects of autism. All 6 of the participants mentioned empathy in a positive way, which goes against the stereotype of us having no empathy. So this is relevant for theories like double empathy problem by Damon Milton, or cross-neurological theory of mind as Luke Bearden's theory. And it could be relevant that all of the participants had at least one autistic child, which wasn't a prerequisite of being in the study, it just worked out that way. But it's also kind of unsurprising because quite a lot of people get diagnosed because their child is autistic. So you often find that autistic parents do have autistic children. Autism acceptance came up as a positive. One of the participants mentioned how his son was really used to spot the autistic children in his school and be really kind to them, and he thought that that had come from how he as a parent was so accepting of difference, and it had rubbed off on his children, and so that was definitely a positive. And that is something that you see in the literature about disabled parents more generally, that people can be more accepting of difference, and so that's a good thing. Stress came up, unsurprisingly, got mentioned by I think all of the participants, but if you think about it, it's already quite, well, very stressful being autistic in a non-autistic world. And then there's loads of research on how it's stressful parenting an autistic child, because you've got to support them to manage life as an autistic child in a non-autistic world. You've got to fight for them at school, advocate for them, and so there's already a lot of stress there. And then just parenting on the whole is more stressful for everybody, because you get this increased workload all of a sudden, a lot of things that you've got to learn anew. So that it's unsurprising that that came up in a negative way. Relationships was huge, but mostly negative, sadly. On the positive side, the relationship when the child was mentioned in a positive way by everybody. There was a lot of love for the children, and that is congruent with some more research that has been done since I did mine by Doug Dale et al., which was published in 2021, which is about intense love of autistic mothers. So that's great. But if we then looked at the wider family, it was a bit more mixed. So a lot of the participants didn't really have support near them from family. One lady said that her support from her parents was compulsory support, and she didn't really have any choice about it. Relationships with others was generally quite negative. There were mention of things like forced interactions, which you do get a lot of as a parent, of the extra appointments that you have to have, but also things like the school gates, so being forced to go to children's parties with your child when they're young. So that was seen negatively. And relationship with professionals, all 6 participants were negative about their relationship with professionals. Only 2 had something positive to say, as well as the negative experiences. And this is quite worrying, because as an autistic parent, you're more likely to have contact with places like school or social services. And so if the relationships are going wrong, it was a worry. And actually 3 out of the 6 participants feared losing their child at some point. So for one participant, it was a custody battle with an ex-partner, and then for 2 others, it was down to social services interventions. One lady who had quite a lot of social services, the lady who struggled with feeding her child, she did actually have some positive stories to report, both about her family support and some of the social workers. She said that she went to stay with her aunt and sister, her aunt and her cousin, and they helped her with her baby and get him back up to weight with the feeding. And that showed social services that she had some support, so that was positive. And she also said some of the social workers were really kind and helped to get benefits, which she relies on to this day, and helped to get things like that, practical things that she needed, like a new fridge. But on the whole, most of the quotes that were said about professionals were things like hostile, aggressive, complete lack of understanding, and that included education professionals and social services and medical professionals. So if we come on to the risk of losing child and look at that in a bit more detail, I said that 3 participants were worried about it. Hayley said that social workers told her that she wasn't engaging with her baby properly, which upset her a lot. And that's quite important when you look at it in the context of autism, because a lot of the judgments that were being made about parenting were coming from presumably a non-autistic perspective, because most of the population aren't autistic. And sometimes, as a parent to autistic children, you often have to parent in a different way, and as an autistic parent. And I think if that's being judged by people who don't have a thorough understanding of autism, there's quite a high chance that that's going to lead to negative, unfair judgments, and which could mean in the long run the risk of losing child. So parents were understandably anxious. Now, one topic that came up and which led to my choice of PhD was fabricated or induced illness. So Lily got accused of this. It used to be called Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They said social services and medical professionals said that she was making up her child's problems. In hindsight, when she looked back, she thinks it was because she was autistic. So she behaved differently and they didn't understand why, and they put 2 and 2 together and got 5. So here's some of her quotes. It was out of their understanding of how people operate, and my reactions to things weren't how people normally operate. So they knew there was something, and looking back, I can see why they came to the conclusions that they did. Even after it was proved that I didn't have Munchausen by proxy, there was still interactions with professionals where there was no doubt that they still believed it. So that's one of the things that I'm learning about as I do my PhD, is how sticky this can be. Once you're accused of fabricated or induced illness, or once it's in your notes, it's really hard to get rid of the stigma, and then you don't get taken seriously again. And it makes people scared of going to the doctors or to see professionals, and people kind of shy away from that, which means they're not getting the medical support that they need or any other kind of support. Some of my learnings from doing this research and the PhD that I'm doing now, many of the problems that autistic parents face come from stigma and unfair negative judgments, which is what happens for autistic people generally. So it's consistent with what it's like to be autistic. So it's not necessarily autism itself, it's the way we can be perceived and misunderstood. Autistic people and their families are subjected to epistemological injustice, which leads to violations of their human rights. So essentially, our voices aren't heard. And the last few years, we're starting to see autistic parents, the voices of autistic parents, get into the literature with these research that's been done. And I've got some reference slides on this, which you'll be able to look at, because I know you will have access to the slides afterwards. So we are getting research now that it's starting to grow, which is great. But still, a medical view is seen as correct, and you rarely see the autistic perspective in the literature on fabricated and induced illness, as an example. And just like we need to respect diversity of people, we also need to respect diversity of parenting, which doesn't happen at the moment, in my view. A lot of what you see in the literature and also professional guidance, so the FII guidance, for example, is very normative. It's about comparing individual parents to normal behaviour, such as the child should be going to school and socialising with friends, and then autistic people and autistic parents are going to become marginalised and stigmatised. So I've got a few slides of references here. Mostly, I haven't mentioned them all in my presentation, but I thought that people can go and look if they want any further information. Thank you for listening. Bye.